Along about November of last year, some friends of mine on Facebook brought this book to my attention. Lostmans Heritage is done by Karen Yvonne Hamilton, who has graciously appeared here to speak today. And it deals with some people that you didn't even know really existed. If you look at maps of Monroe County, where Key West is, the vast majority of it is located on the mainland in the southwest lower tip of the peninsula. You know, right now, it's under the domain of the National Park Service, so nobody lives there anymore. But there were people that lived there at one point in time, about midway up to the extent of the border for Monroe County on the mainland is a river called Lostmans River. It goes back into the Everglades. And people who wanted to be lost would definitely go there to live and mind their own business, do whatever it is that they wanted to do. After the National Park Service took it over, of course, they all had to leave, but all those people that lived there have always been kind of a very attractive group to me because we didn't know what was going on there. Nobody knew. Our speaker today, who is also the proprietor of Yesterday Press, does have lineage to those folks. Very interesting book. I asked her to bring some with her. She did. And now I'd like you all to welcome Karen Yvonne Hamilton.
Hello.
Thank you.
Yes.
Can they hear you?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I have a really big mouth, so I can talk louder. I teach high school English, so I'm used to teaching to a room full of 30 really loud teenagers. If I get too loud, just I was thinking about yesterday when I was looking at the title of this, Researching Hidden Ancestors, and I thought anybody who does this, and you research your family history, we start out, it's all hidden for the most part. We hear some stories, and then we do the usual thing. We go and we look up birth certificates and marriage certificates and whatnot. I kind of went along listening to my father's stories, my whole childhood, about my family, who grew up in the Everglades. My father was born in Key West. His family lived in the 10,000 Islands. They were pioneers there. And his father was murdered, my grandfather, down there in 1932. So my father never met his father. And his mother moved my father and his brothers around from Key West to Fort Myers and back down into the islands, trying to raise these three boys on her own. So he didn't spend as much time there as a lot of the other family members that I've met in the last few years have. Got a lot of information from them. But Daddy has a lot of stories. And I listened, and I decided that I wanted to know where my surname came from, finally, Hamilton. I had no idea really how common Hamilton was. It's interesting because I come in here and a couple of people here have said to me, now I know why you go by Karen Yvonne Hamilton, because there's a lot of Karen Hamiltons out there. If you Google me, you'll find them. So I go to look up my surname, and I take the advice of anybody who's done family history and start with your parents and work backwards, right? That's how you start. So that's how I started. I had no idea what I was getting into. My father had a lot of secrets that I found out as we went along. So the first thing he did was he gave me this book, Man in the Everglades by Charlton Chabot. He is like the noted Florida historian. My father corresponded with him a bit. There's a whole chapter in here called On Lostmans and Shark River that is about the Hamilton family. And it was the first place that I found that our family was talked about. And in this, I found this quote from Mr. Chabot, that Richard Hamilton, my great-great-grandfather, had served in the Civil War, fighting among other places in the Battle of Natural Bridge to defend Tallahassee at the very end of the war. This is very exciting. My great-great-grandfather fought for the Union Army in the Civil War. It was very exciting. And so I decided I would go ahead and order his military records. Now, mind you, this was in the 80s, didn't have the internet, right? Had to first go to the library and find the forms to fill out. Then you had to send them to the National Archives, and then you had to sit back and wait to get those documents. So, this is Richard Hamilton, my great-great-grandfather, when he was young, and again, when he was approaching 100. So, he lived a very long and fascinating life. I get the documents in the mail, very thick envelope. It's over 200 pages worth of records and depositions, and the first thing I noticed was Richard Hamilton's name is not on there. Okay, it says Stephen Barrett, and I'm like, who the heck is Stephen Barrett? I don't understand. So I called National Archives and explained to them, you sent me the wrong records. I'm trying to get my great-great-grandfather's military records from the Civil War. And after a lot of going back and forth, the man says, did you read them yet? And I'm brand new to family research at this point, genealogy. And I said, no, not really. So I sit down and I start reading them, and pretty much my world just kind of exploded. And I'm calling my sister going, you will not believe what I just found out about our family. This was the main document, and you can't see it very well here. But this is a deposition from my great-great-grandfather, Richard. This turns out to be a pension case. Not just a pension case, but a pension fraud case. Okay? Because my great-great-grandfather decided to file for a military pension, saying he fought in the Civil War as a black soldier with the Union Army, and it turns out he wasn't ever even there. He might have gotten away with this, except for the real soldier, Stephen Barrett. Barrett's wife, that's another story. Barrett's wife had filed a widow's pension claim. Okay, so to be a widow, your husband has to be dead, right? So the special examiners at the U.S. Pension Office are going, oh, we got this Stephen Barrett wants to file a claim, but his widow is also, what is going on? So, yeah, over 200 documents going back and forth saying, what the heck is going on? Well, they finally find Richard here, and I believe, I'm not sure what year this one was. He was 62 years old at the time. They get him in. He says, and thank you to my sister. That's my sister back there. She'll yell at me for telling me. She helped with the transcription, and he says his occupation is cattle raising and burning coal. It's interesting. He says he's a carpenter by trade, and he was born on July 26, 1840, which we later figured out that's not true. A lot of what Richard says is not true. And he was born in Savannah, Georgia. Okay, I had someplace to go now, right? Go to Savannah. And then we get into the name of his father, which we didn't know. His father was William Edwards. Hey, this is so exciting, right? You know the feeling. But he's dead, and he died in Marion County, Florida. And he talks about there's one son living, and he names them, and so on. He says his mother's name is Peggy Hamilton. Now I'm going, wait, why does his mother have the name Hamilton and his father is Edwards? It goes on to where he starts talking about the slaves that Edwards owned, and that he and his mother were slaves, owned by William Edwards. So at this point, I'm going, whoa, wait a minute. He also says his mother was full-blooded Choctaw. Again, Richard lies. So we find that out later. Well, let me go on, or I'll confuse you as much as I was confused. I made a chart. I'm a very visual person. I had my office lined with this stuff. Big timeline. So I give memoir workshops around town and online. And I always tell them, start with a timeline. Got to start with a timeline. So I made a timeline on the wall and laid out these different places that I pulled from these depositions. So I had Ocala area and Pine Level, Arcadia, and of course the Everglades, which that was the only thing that was a for sure for me. So I get that up, and the Barrett case, as we call it, falls in the middle there while he's in the Everglades. And this is, I sent that to my sister. And you know that feeling, don't you? So,
No, of course not.
anybody who's done genealogy knows that. You also want to put a mattress up on the wall so you can bang your head on it now. But with all the little challenges that we face as genealogists, sometimes you hit the one big challenge. That's like, how am I going to get past this one, right? I didn't hit one, I hit 4 big ones that I had to get past. So, here are my challenges. First, of course, was slavery. I had to figure out how in the heck, I have no clue how to search slave ancestry. So that was totally new to me. Next, we get into plural marriage. One of the keys down there in the Everglades, one of the islands, it's actually called Mormon Key. And, and Charlton Tebow will tell you that was named after my great-grandfather, Richard Hamilton. Not only was he a slave, he was a fraud, and don't get me wrong, he was a nice guy. He really He did, I know. People loved him too. Anyway, he was I'll get into Richard when we get down into the Glades. So I get down into the Glades, now we got all kinds of secrets. If you know anything about the Florida Everglades at this time, during Prohibition and whatnot, there was a lot of bad stuff going on down there. Anybody heard of Edgar Watson?
Mm-hmm. Yes, killing
Watson.
Mr. Watson.
Yeah, killing him. We're going to get into killing Mr. Watson too. And the next thing was family. Family present day. If you take a bunch of people and tell them that your ancestors were African, part African, possibly part Indian, and they were slaves. And not everybody in the family was happy about this. And not everybody in the family wanted to, share the secret. So I'm mostly popular, but there's a few that my sister likes. Here are my charts. These are the charts I have all over the wall. Again, my sister bought me these chart paper. They're sticky notes. They're giant sticky notes. You gotta love them. And he suggested you try it because you could just move them right on the wall. I sat in my swivel chair in my office and I would just swivel around. And I needed this. That's great. Okay, challenge number 1, slavery. I'm going to do a really, really fast history of slavery in Florida, in case you didn't know. We had the first Spanish rule, 1500s, 1700s. The Native Americans in Florida at that time, and under Spanish rule, they were encouraging the slaves from up north to come down to Florida. If they converted to Catholicism, they would give them land, etc. So there was a plethora of escapees into northern Florida. Spanish viewed the slaves under Roman law. That simply means they treated them like human beings. The Spanish saw the black man as a human being versus the British, who saw them as chattel, as animals. And I don't mean to be global here. Of course, not everybody did, but generally. So, and it was kind of slow to develop slavery in Florida. I'm not saying that Native Americans and Seminoles, they enslaved some of them, but they didn't treat them that way. They treated them like the Spanish. They didn't, beat them and all that. It was kind of like just labor, indentured servant type of thing. Okay? So then the British come in. You see, they didn't stay in for very long. They're gone again. Here come the Spanish again, and they're bringing in. Now they're bringing in even more slaves to come to Florida because mostly they want to piss off the British. Everything I read, that's what it says. They told the British, the British said, you got to give us back our slaves, and they're like, no, you can go get them yourself. They're out there in the wilds of Florida. Knock yourself out. So this is real quick. We had from 1827 to 1847, we had the rules coming up for freed slaves. There were a lot of freed slaves here. They've been here a while. So in 1828, they were not allowed to assemble in public. A freed slave, a Negro freed Negro. In 1845, Florida is admitted to the Union as the 27th U.S. state. And in 1847, all free Negroes had to have a white person as a legal guardian. I did not know this.
Huh.
Yeah. So, in other words, if you owned a slave, and you're their legal guardian, so if they do something wrong, guess who gets in trouble? The owner did. I found that kind of interesting. So this is about the time that William Edwards, the man who owned my great-great-grandfather, moved down into Florida from Savannah, Georgia area. Now when you go to research this stuff, you find there's no registers of slaves before 1812. There just aren't any. So you've got to go find the owner. Luckily I was able to find the owner. Some people aren't that lucky. But if you can get the owner's name, then you can do your research on the owner. Okay? Private papers of the slave owner, we did not have any luck with that because, of course, there was a fire. You can't get to them, but you can talk to the family if you can find a family, and we did. We went up there. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Another interesting. Local archives, libraries might have diaries or some documents that you can find out more about the owner. Now, the 1850 census was the first census that started reporting more than just the name of the head of household. We started getting more, years and occupations and property. We own this property, etc. Most of the 1850 censuses do not even always have the name of the families, and they certainly don't have slaves. So you're out of luck with that. So, on the 1800, 1850, and 1860 census, you're only going to see free persons. And you might see slaves, but there won't be any names or anything. It's kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack at this point when you're trying to find your slaves. Census is not the way to go. You're only going to get the owner that way. So, this is a 1850 census roll. These are the Edwards family in Savannah in 1850. And you see there isn't a lot there, just names and gender, age, property value. Doesn't tell what they do for a living or anything. Now we get to the 1860 census, a little bit better, because now you can see the freed slaves are actually listed on here. So, but if you're looking for your slave ancestor and they're not on that 1860 census, that means they were not free. Okay, they were enslaved. If they were a black person living in this country in 1860 and they're not on the census, then they were enslaved. Okay. So what do you do now? You can jump to the slave schedules. You can have slave schedules, which helped a little bit. This slave schedule shows only the owner's name and the age, usually just the age of the slave, and the gender. So from this, I was able to get hold of William Edwards' slave schedule that showed he had 3 slaves. And going back from the dates that I had for Richard and his mother, I was able to piece together that this was probably them. So it's a lot of puzzle pieces, which, genealogy. Another thing we had trouble with, and which was new to us, was deciphering race on these census records, because you had white, B for black, MU for mulatto, sometimes it says MUL for mulatto. You're not going to find Indians on these because the Native Americans had their own census that they took. All right, manumission documents, that's just free. You're free. Slaves that were freed, there are records for that you can look up online. I didn't look at those because my ancestors didn't get freed until after the Civil War. Okay, so if you go in, once you've got that slave owner's name and where they're from, you can look up their land records and find out exactly where they lived, which is what we did. And my sister and I loaded up the RV and went to some of these places. This was Noonensville, Florida, where William came in 1850, and the little circle is one of his property. Now this is helpful too when you get these land records, because now you see just how prosperous they were. We tend to think slave owners had these huge plantations, you know, Gone with the Wind type thing. But not all of them did. They had little, very small pieces of property. There are much larger ones around there. This is William Edwards' father, Odaiba, from Georgia. And he owned 700 acres. We got his records and found out he owned 700 acres, which was pretty cool. So off we went to Springfield, which we now knew was Springfield because of the land records. Springfield is, I don't know, 20 miles or so northwest of Savannah. All we'd ever heard was Savannah. We were headed to Savannah, but we didn't need to go to Savannah at all. We needed to go to Springfield, Effingham County. This is William Edwards, the man who owned my great-great-grandfather, and this is Richard's mother, Peggy. It's the only likeness we have of her. I don't know who drew the picture, but they called her Peggy. That was the only name she knew, was Peggy Hamilton. And of course, by now I've kind of figured out that Hamilton is not attached to any great English noble lord or anything. And I've since, after doing all this research, actually, the slave research, I noticed there's a lot of Hamiltons. This slave, it was a common slave name, Hamilton. So, and that's why I use Karen Yvonne. You can find me. So that's William, and they called him Captain Billy, the slaves. We found out this from all those depositions. The children and the slaves, they called him Captain Billy. And that was Peggy. And we're not sure, never have figured that one out. Was he really the father of Richard or not? Richard insists he is, but of course, William's legitimate children say, oh, no. What are you going to do? Okay, so here's just a little map of Springfield and Effingham County. Savannah's down there, Springfield's up there. Now, this was interesting. We go to Springfield, we get there, and it's just incredible. There's this living history behind these gates, and we're so excited that we get to go through these buildings that were around the time that our ancestors lived there, and it's locked. It was locked. And so we couldn't go in, so we just stood at the gate and, looked through and figured we'll come back another time when they're open. So we get in the van and we're going to leave, and this man comes driving up, and he gets out and he unlocks the gate, and he goes in, he does something, and he comes back out, and we're like, let us in. We talked to him, and he wasn't going to let us in. But he did start talking to us, and we told him what we were doing, that we were there to research our family history, William Pitts Edwards, and he got so excited. He was so excited. He said, there's so many Edwards around here. I'm an Edwards. And he gets on the phone. No lie. He gets on the phone and he calls, I don't know if it was his uncle, his grandparent, I don't know, somebody. And he hands the phone to my sister. And this man is telling my sister all about the Edwards family. And I'm sitting there rolling my eyes going, I already know all this. I already looked all this up. But we're trying to be polite. So finally, she's able to get off the phone and get the phone back to him, and he's all excited. And he says, we have a family history event every year, and you should come. And we have an Edwards reunion, and all the Edwards come to this reunion every year, and you've got to come. So we're like, we'll think about that. we'll think about that. And then we sat there, and we thought, now how do we introduce ourselves when we go to this reunion of all the Edwards? Hi, my name is Karen, and your ancestor owned my ancestor. I don't know how to work that in. I wish that we had thought about it. Maybe this summer we'll go. She's taking some. I want to go because maybe some stories have been handed down that might mention Richard and Peggy. And Peggy we know nothing about, really. We don't know much about her, and I want to know more. So maybe somebody has a story. I'm going without you. Okay, so that Springfield was kind of a bust, but it was kind of cool to be there and see the area. So then we head down to the next stop. Edwards moved, took his family and his property, including my ancestors, and he moved down to Levi County, to a little town called Williston. This was another one we didn't know. All we'd ever heard from my father, from everybody, was they lived in Ocala. You know, Ocala. It wasn't Ocala. They didn't live in Ocala. They lived in Williston. And it was the land records that told me that. So I can't stress that enough. Get all the land records so you know exactly where you're going. You're not wasting your time going somewhere you don't need to go. So, they moved down in 1850, 1861. Florida secedes from the U.S. Okay, and their main reason for doing that, they said, was, we want to protect slavery. Slavery was everything. When you look at the population rolls from this time period, especially in North Florida, more than half of the population were slaves. Okay? So that just kind of blows your mind when you think about it, that more than half were slaves. So that I was able to literally drive down the road, turn down the road, and be there, right there, where my ancestors walked, where they were slaves. It gives me chills still. I took my shoes off and walked around. I just wanted to feel it. Maybe they walked here. It's beautiful. I don't know what it looked like when they were there, but they were there till the Edwards were there, long after the war. And Peggy was there till she died. She's buried somewhere around there. And there's a cemetery there, somewhere where Peggy apparently is buried. And we, again, couldn't work up the courage to ask somebody, because it's on private Edwards property. So we hit the local archives there. Always a good resource if you're researching anything. Wherever you go, get in the car, go to these places, visit the libraries, amazing resources, historical societies, genealogical societies. This place in Williston had this fabulous room at their library. It was full of notebooks and stories and books, and we spent a few hours in there going through all of these. In 1863, we had Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which so many people think that's when slavery ended. It's not. It was mainly just a declaration of war, and slaves were still slaves. They didn't get freed till after the war. It's interesting that I teach high school English, and we just covered this in my English class because we were studying the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, my students hate me because all I talk about is my like, yeah, we know you're from the Everglades. Let it go. So, anyway, so the 13th Amendment ended slavery finally in 1865. And these are Union soldiers, which we now know Richard was not. Oh, from those depositions, and I kind of glossed over that, we found out that Richard did serve in the war in a little bit of a capacity, because two of Edward's sons, which by Richard's account would be his half-brothers, took him with them to serve in the Confederate Army, obviously, as a cook. So he did serve as a cook for his owners. And that's all. That's the only military service that he had. So Civil War ends. And Richard leaves. Peggy decides to stay. During this time period, right after the Civil War, a lot of the slaves went north. The Union soldiers and missionaries were, again, when I'm talking about Florida, slaves in Florida, slavery in Florida. They encouraged them to stay with their owners. And some did. Some migrated north. They just got the heck out of Dodge and went north. Many others went south. Remember, during North Florida, a lot of them were near the water. They were fishermen, these slaves. They were farmers and fishermen, etc. They wanted to stay in Florida. The climate alone was worth it. So a lot of them went south to what has been called the last frontier, South Florida. And quite a few of them decided to follow the Peace River, which you can't see too much on here. It's this, I should have my stick that I have at work. Love my classroom. This here is the Charlotte Harbor up around the west coast, and the Peace River goes all the way up to Central Florida. And all along there is fertile land. So the slaves start coming down that way and making little settlements here and there all the way down. Richard ends up in near Arcadia, a little town called Pine Level. Pine Level, has anybody heard of Pine Level?
Yes.
Yeah. Really? That's so exciting. A lot of people have no idea. There's two of them, by the way. There's one in northern Florida, and there's one down by Arcadia on the other side of Lake Okeechobee. Pine Level. We go there. There's nothing there anymore. There's a little cemetery. There's the hanging tree, which I'll show you a picture of. But there's nothing there for us other than to just, again, feel where our ancestors were. Arcadia and Pine Level were often called the freedmen's town because a lot of the freedmen, that former slaves, a lot of freedmen came there to settle and farm, and it was quiet. It was a little quieter there if you were in Pine Level. Not in Arcadia. Arcadia was wild. They called it the Wild Wild West of the East because it was really bad. Shootings and hangings, and the Sarasota vigilantes were there. I had a statistic somewhere how many people were hung in Arcadia. I can't remember what it is now. Anyway, so this is where Richard goes, and he meets a woman called Hannah. And most of the accounts say she was white. I've had a few that said she might have been black, but I'm pretty sure that she was white. And they had quite a few children who are all listed as mulatto on the censuses. So, the Freedmen's Bureau, that's a pretty good resource if your ancestors got involved in it. The government came up during Reconstruction and started trying to help the freed slaves get jobs, get settled, and they didn't know anything else. And that I can't even imagine, to have been told what to do your whole life, and now what do you do? If you were lucky, you had a trade, so you could go out and make a living. But the government did set up this Freedmen's Bureau, so you can check the Freedmen's Bureau records to see if your ancestor is listed on there. And it also lists the Freedmen's Bureau marriages, because a lot of the slaves were not married, not legally married. The missionaries were going around saying, you've got to get legally married, you're now a United States citizen, and you can't just marry and divorce without doing it on paper. So that's another thing. There's no birth certificates. Very rarely death certificates. Everything is in that owner's notebook. And if there was a fire, like in our case, it's lost. It's all gone. They didn't do birth certificates for slaves. So the Freedmen's Bureau helped with that. Also the voters' registration records. Another thing I did not know was that in Florida we had the first Reconstruction Act, which stated there had to be these military districts, including Florida. And interestingly, they policed these with colored troops. Second Reconstruction Act said you had to include the freedmen. We've got everybody voting now, but wait, you forgot you need to include the freedmen. They're not slaves anymore. So they do that. And then they said you have to have 3 men as registrars to go around and register all these new voters, and one of them has to be a freedman. Now, the man that Richard lived next door to in Pine Level was one of these registrars. And later on, I read an article about him, and they got in a huge fight, and there was a stabbing or something. It's in the book. So I did find Richard's voter's registration. And this is from 1870. Notice how they spelled his name. That would not be uncommon to me because I still hear a lot of people in the Everglades pronouncing it this way. So that's something you got to watch out for, as I'm sure you know, is the misspellings. You can't just stick to one. You got to go by sound. So, and then you've got, even I had Cantor Brown. Have you heard of Cantor Brown? He's a big Florida historian also. He's written quite a few books. I highly, highly respect the man. But in this particular book, he talks about Richard Hamilton and where he might have come from. And half of his information about my ancestor is right on target, And the other half is like, where the heck did you get this from? This whole first paragraph is not my Richard at all. So, again, you have to be careful of that. We always say consider the source. And I tell my students, teaching them how to do research, like, you have to consider your source. But sometimes even when you trust your source, they still might have got it wrong. So I'm sure this was an older book. I'm sure Cantor Brown knows his mistake by now. Hope. If not, I'm going to send him a copy of my book.
Quick question.
Yes.
Cantor Brown, how do you spell the first name?
C-A-N-T-O-R.
Oh, good. Got it right.
Okay, second challenge. This is one of the store owners down in Everglades City. He writes, and when he's being interviewed, he says, when you have located your man, talking about Richard Hamilton, you will find a dishonest, contemptible, lawless vagabond, and he a Negro having 2 living wives and families, none of which dare to live with him for fear of violence. This is a reputation that he has down in the Everglades. But plural marriage, like I said, slaves, not just slaves, but the Indians, outcasts of society, pay attention to the rules. They just, I like you, let's get married. You know. So they go off and they be married for a while, and they say, I don't like you anymore, and we're divorced, and then they go marry another one. And then the men traveled around. In Florida, unless you had some kind of trade where you could open a store, you kind of had to go, where the farming was good, and the fishing was good, etc. So you moved around, so you might have a family over here, and a family over here, which Richard did. So, again, Mormon key.
Of course.
Yes. So, the Florida slave narratives, I gotta say, helped a lot, and that should be on your list too, is to look up the Florida slave narratives. Fascinating stuff, just about the history of Florida in general, not just what the slaves had to go through. Where we have our next challenge, which was silence and secrets, a lot of silence going on, to try and get people to talk. People don't want to let their secrets go. And that's why they went there. That's, you know, by this time Richard is being sought. He's a fugitive from justice for his pension fraud thing, which is still going on. So he goes down to the Everglades. I'm sure he had other things he was being sought for. You can see Hamilton Mound. That's still there. The Park Service still calls it Hamilton Mound. That's where my great-grandmother stayed mostly there, Wood Key, Hog Key. And they migrated up and down, all around there. But 1885, we had a visitor say, you know, man might hide himself here, providing he could only live and remain uncaught forever. Tracking him would be impossible. So if you don't know somebody down there, you can get lost very easily, which is exactly what Richard wanted to do, and what my family, his children, wanted to do. Killing Mr. Watson. I love Matheson. I do. Fabulous writer. I met so many people that met him. I have a letter from him. He actually, because I wrote him after Killing Mr. Watson came out. My family is in it. Has anybody read Killing Mr. Watson? You have? Okay, so you've met Richard Hamilton already. Richard Hamilton, in Killing Mr. Watson, is very much on target. Matheson did a pretty good job of explaining all of my family members in that book, bringing them to life and making them speak. It is fictional, though. I have to keep reminding people that it is fictional. He did tweak things here and there to make a story. So after this came out in the 90s, I wanted more than anything to get back to writing my book, writing Lostmans Heritage, because I wanted people to know my ancestors. Because so far, to this point, anything you read about the Everglades, it was all distorters and Smallwoods and all the big names. And I'm like, where are my family? They were pioneers too. And I wanted their story told. So that's part of the reason that I wrote this. I think that was the poem you saw in the beginning, The Ghosts. I wanted to let the ghosts speak. I think you know that feeling too. So It helps to have an infamous serial killer in the story. Good old Edgar Watson, who serial killer down there in the Everglades during Prohibition, and a lot of speakeasies and moonshining going on, and Watson going around killing everybody. Family stories tell me that Watson sat down to dinner with our family a lot, and that he was a nice man, considering he had a penchant for killing people. But they knew him. Matter of fact, when after the hurricane, and when they found the bodies of Watson's latest victims, and the people at Chokoloskee decided that it was enough and it was time for Ed Watson to go, my great-grandfather, he ran into, this is the story I hear, is that he ran into out there in the alleyways of the swamps, Ed Watson. My great-grandfather was headed to Smallwood Store to get supplies because the hurricane had wiped them out and he needed to get supplies. And he runs into Watson and he says, a lot of bad blood going on, and you really probably don't want to keep going there. And Watson says, I know. And he went on. So, my great-grandfather wasn't one of the shooters, but he was there, he watched it happen, and he didn't get involved. And I thought about that a lot, and I thought, why would my family have wanted to get involved? They're already outcasts among outcasts, okay? They weren't treated that great. They were, everyone down there saw them as black, even though they didn't really look black. But at any rate, so they were there. Then we had Henry Short, who some say was the actual shooter. A lot of people in my family still say he was the shooter because they want to claim it because he's one of ours. He married one of Richard's daughters, Henry Short did. Henry Short was a very noticeable black man, and he was there, and he did fire, but we don't know that it was his shot that killed Watson. Nobody knows. There's a lot of shots fired. We don't know who the kill shot was. But at any rate, Henry Short goes down in history as the man who killed Ed Watson. Now, having that story led me to newspapers.com. Do you know what newspapers.com is?
Yes.
I'm so glad to hear a lot of yes, because if you don't know newspapers.com yet, you need to get on it. Because you'll find so much in there. I spend way too much time on newspapers.com. You can find anything you want there. But the articles, oh my God, between everything that Richard did, between my great-grandfather, the one who met Watson, he was a deputy sheriff down there, so there's articles about him. And I found this one about Robert. Richard had a lot of names. He went by Robert, too. So, and it's funny, I think is this the one where he says he's from Norway? Oh yeah, down here. He says he's from Nova Scotia. He lied. Someone on one of the Facebook things just told me, they said, what is this thing? I heard Richard Hamilton was from Nova Scotia or somewhere. And I said, you gotta understand. Richard lies. Get that through your head. Pathological. I think he just, made a good story. Wherever he was, he just made it up on the spot. Again, I don't think he was like this horrible man. But anyway, here's another one from the Key West Citizen. The notorious outlaw and Negro desperado, Richard Hamilton, after 16 or 17 years of scouting, has at last been captured by, get this, Deputy Edgar J. Watson. They deputized everybody down there. My uncle told me, because he grew up down there, he said, they were just, something happened, and there's not a lot of people down there. It's the Florida Everglades. Not a lot of people live down there. So things went down, and they just looked around, and they didn't go, you want to be deputy sheriff for the day? Get your badge on. So Edgar supposedly arrests Richard. Interestingly enough, it's a few years later, Richard gets deputized and arrests Watson and puts him on a boat and is taking him to Key West. And he tells Watson, he said, I'm going to fall asleep. I got to get a little bit of sleep. You keep the boat pointed Key West. So, and he goes, and don't do any funny business, Watson, because my daddy was a Cherokee, and Choctaw, Cherokee, my owner, who knows? We don't know. So onward he goes. But these articles were just great to find these. Oh, I found this one. It's the notice of condemnation from the United States District Court evicting my family from the 10,000 Islands. And my ancestors are listed on it, telling them we're condemning this property and you need to get out. Because we're going to make it a park. So you need to go. And this goes back and forth with some say that their houses got burned down so they move out, and then some in the family say that they burned them down deliberately. There was a lot going on when that happened. But I found a lot of documents about this whole time period when the residents were being evicted, and it took years for them all. I mean, you imagine they've been down there for 100 years, and it's the only home all these people knew. And so they had to leave. That's in the book. Moonshining. They were moonshining, doing a lot of stills. My father's uncle was the biggest one, Walter. There's still some remains of one of his stills out there on one of the islands. This is where secrets come in. I'm not allowed to tell where it is. So, territory rights. This is what happened to my grandfather. I never got to meet when he was 26. I think he was only 26. He and his cousin were just disappeared. They went on a hunting trip and they never came back. And we didn't find out till much later when I found an article where my deputy sheriff great-grandfather says, you know, I left the boys there. There was a mob, and I left the boys there to go get help. And but they never found them. They called the Coast Guard in, they searched, but they never found them. Years later, one of the another family says, yeah, you know, they were stealing our traps. They were getting in our traps. They were coming in our territory. So we gunned them down and we left them for dead. So that's where they are out there. They were, I think his cousin was even younger. They had small children. My grandmother had 2 boys and my father, pregnant with my father, when my grandfather disappeared. So, but that was going on all the time. They called it the fish wars. It was just a global term that journalists used to talk about the fish wars going on in Alaska, even just anywhere. They called them the fish wars, fighting over territory rights. This is my spot. This is where I fish, and you're not allowed here. And in the Everglades, there was an unwritten code. Everybody knew whose spot was whose. Smuggling, my family, as far as I know, was not involved in smuggling, but there was smuggling going on. Chinese people go to Cuba, they pick up Chinese refugees. There was one very unreputable man who used to pick them up, bring them out to the middle of the water, and throw them overboard after he got their money. So that kind of thing was going on. Racism, of course, was happening. My family, like I said, were the outcasts among the outcasts. They didn't mingle with the Smallwoods and the Starters, in other words. But, I mean, they were cordial. People were cordial. The final challenge was family. This goes right into today. The hoarding of stuff. If you've encountered that, you get great-grandma has a whole attic full of stuff, but her daughter isn't going to give it to you because that's mine.
Yeah.
Doesn't want to share it. Secret alliances, then you get them getting together and saying, we're not going to let Karen have that. Don't tell Karen anything. She's going to be there. Don't tell her anything because she's writing a book, and I'm going to write a book, and, you know, it goes on. I just kind of let it all wash over me and keep doing what I'm doing. This is me at the Smallwood Store.
Where is that store?
That's in Chokoloskee. If you go to Everglades City, just due south of Everglades City, you hit Chokoloskee. And once you get to Chokoloskee, then there's a lot of water in the 10,000 Islands. Go south from there. So they my ancestors in the 10,000 Islands would frequently go up to Chokoloskee, to Smallwood Store. It was like the major trading post. It's a fascinating place to visit. And if you're interested, next Wednesday they're having an Everglades City Expo. So I'll be at that. And the whole city, Chokoloskee, Smallwood Store, everybody's going to be there to learn about the Everglades. I didn't really talk about the Indians because I didn't do any research much. I kind of gave up on that whole avenue, but I did just real quickly want to tell you about the Dawes Commission, because there was this period of time in 1893 when the government decided to document specific tribes and the 5 civilized tribes and give them land. Here comes my ancestors again, one of Richard's sons, Walter, and his wife, Minnie. They decided they would apply to the Dawes Commission. I think Walter said he was Cherokee, and Minnie said she was Choctaw. Neither one of them. But they weren't the only ones, okay? Yeah, come on. They were just trying to get some money. So that didn't last a long time, the Dawes Commission. But you can research the Dawes Commission, the people who applied for it. So if you're researching Native American ancestors, start with the Dawes Commission and work backwards. It's kind of like finding the name and working backwards. This one I love this quote, and I think it's in my book, because there's so many stories that you hear from the documents, from your family members, from just people in general, and what story do you believe, you know? And I think that a lot of people in my family were afraid that I was going to write a book that said this is how it happened. And I didn't do that. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to tell all of the stories and research every possibility. And then you can make up your mind what happened. Like, you know, did Henry Short really kill Ed Watson? I don't know. So I researched all of the stories. You know, I went to Key West and I talked to Tom Hambright, the historian there, because he had talked to Matheson and he had done a lot of research on the Watson story. And so, yeah, I just gathered everything I could gather, and then I gave it to him in the book. I put it in the book. And the quote, English historian G. Kitson Clark, he was talking about the generalities that we all gather, and he said, these are necessarily founded on guesses. Guesses informed by much general reading and relevant knowledge. Guesses shaped by much brooding on the matter in hand, but on guesses nonetheless. And that's what we do as family historians. This is all that we can do, is gather all the facts and stories. And guess. That's all we can do is make a guess. So that is what I did. And I put it all together into Lostmans Heritage. I did have University of Florida Press, who I was really excited when they said they were interested in my book. I went around on a high for quite a while. I'm going to be published by University Press of Florida. And 6 months later, they said, well, we've decided that we're only going to focus on historical. We don't want any type of memoir thing. So I would have been required to remove my journey, what I just told you, from the story. And to me, that was too much. I couldn't do that. That was the story, the actual research that I did. And so I published it myself. I had published some educational things in the past, so I kind of knew what I was doing, and I just created my own press. And got quite a few people, historians that I've met who are writing books who want to, publish under my press. I did this myself. I had this fabulous friend of mine, Jenna Redmond, who designed the cover for me, and it's been doing really well. I'm selling at a nice little clip. So, next thing I did after all those challenges, and still fighting Fighting Those Challenges. That book's got to come out again, my second edition, because I'm already learning more things. Next thing we're doing is, we've got to go to the Bahamas next. We're doing my mother's side of the family, and interestingly, my mother's side of the family were from the Bahamas, Long Island, Bahamas, and they weren't slaves. They were slave owners. And they were black slave owners. So this should be a really interesting story. But first, I can't pick someplace simple like let's go to Charleston. We have to go not just to the Bahamas, but all the way down there to Long Island, which is going to involve some planes and boats and whatnot. And I hope I don't get seasick. But it'll be fun. So, and then they go to Key West. So most of our research is going to be in the Keys, which I'm excited about that. That's that. That'll be a few years down the road. That's it.